Dale Evans painfully died after revealing her damned husband's.
And who knows the real answer to this thing? I mean, I feel sorry for anyone who has to make the decisions, honestly.
What the public was shown was a glowing, carefully polished life, filled with faith, music, and what looked like a perfect fairy tale romance. But behind that radiant picture, Dale Evans was quietly living a story far more complicated, far more painful, and far more human than anyone ever imagined. To millions of fans, she was simply the devoted partner of Roy Rogers, the legendary cowboy hero adored across America, a symbol of wholesome love wrapped in Western glamour. Yet beneath the bright smiles, the movie set magic, and the comforting image of America's favorite couple, there were years of buried secrets, silent heartbreak, and heavy personal truths she carried alone for decades. And it was only in the final chapter of her life, when the weight of keeping quiet became too heavy to bear, that Dale finally found the courage to speak openly about the reality of her marriage, the private struggles behind the public love story, and the painful regrets that followed her all the way to the very end. Long before fame ever called her name, Dale Evans' life was shaped not by Hollywood magic, but by struggle, loss, and early heartbreak that quietly hardened her far too soon. Before the world ever knew her as the beloved Queen of the West, she was simply Frances Octavia Smith, born on October 31st, 1912 in Uvalde, Texas, into a life that offered very little comfort and almost no stability. A world away from the glowing image audiences would one day fall in love with, her childhood unfolded in deep uncertainty, marked by constant emotional tension and painful family upheaval. Raised for a time by her uncle, Dr. L.D. Massey, in Arkansas, she learned how to grow up far too quickly, learning resilience inside a fragile and unpredictable home where security was never guaranteed and innocence disappeared early. Still barely a teenager, Frances made a decision that would permanently alter the course of her life when she eloped with Thomas F. Fox at only 14 years old. Before she had even turned 16, she was already a mother to a baby boy named Tommy Jr., lovingly called Tommy, and facing responsibilities that most grown adults were never truly prepared to carry. That fragile young marriage began with hope, but collapsed almost as quickly as it started, ending within a year, leaving her divorced, emotionally isolated, and struggling to survive in Memphis, with a small child resting in her arms and an uncertain future ahead of her. With no safety net beneath her and no family wealth to fall back on, survival pushed Frances toward the one gift she could truly depend on, her music. By the late 1920s, she slowly found small but meaningful chances singing and playing piano at local radio stations, including WMC and WREC, using her voice not for fame, but to keep food on the table and a fragile sense of hope alive. Even with undeniable talent and growing confidence, her path forward remained painfully difficult. As rejection followed her from audition to audition, money stayed uncertain and unreliable, and the harsh judgment placed on single mothers quietly followed her everywhere, especially in an industry that demanded spotless reputations, flawless public images, and perfection at any cost. Long before the decade could even reach its final years, and by the time 1929 arrived, the paperwork ending her first marriage was finally signed, stamped, and sealed. It was the official close of a chapter marked by disappointment and emotional loss. But instead of allowing heartbreak to write the story of what came next, she made a deliberate and defiant choice to start over. Determined to rebuild her life on her own terms, she embraced reinvention and remarried later that very same year to August Wayne Jones. At the time, the decision looked like a brave new beginning, a promise of stability and renewal. Yet behind that hopeful step forward was a future already quietly unraveling, and by 1935, the marriage that once symbolized a fresh start would collapse completely. Then, in the early 1930s, everything changed in a way she never could have planned. A simple, unexpected suggestion from a Louisville radio station manager, offered almost casually, would quietly redirect the course of her entire life forever. Born Frances Octavia Smith, she was suddenly encouraged to leave her name and her past behind. In its place, she stepped into a carefully crafted new identity and emerged as Dale Evans. The sound of the name alone was sharp, confident, and impossible to forget. Almost instantly, it began opening doors. The transformation pushed her career forward at remarkable speed, and before long, her silky, captivating voice earned her a contract with 20th Century Fox. But hidden beneath that breakthrough opportunity was an unspoken price, one she was expected to pay without question. To succeed, she would have to erase the life she had lived before fame ever found her. Inside the tightly controlled world of the studio, executives made a chilling demand. She was told to present a new version of herself to the public, and that version could not include her son. Tommy, they insisted, was not to be introduced as her child, but as her younger brother. For years afterwards, Dale lived trapped inside that carefully constructed lie, smiling for cameras, smiling for interviews, while carrying a truth she was forbidden to reveal. To the world, she appeared as a bright, wholesome, rising star. In private, she mourned the motherhood she was forced to hide. That silent heartbreak became only one of many secrets she learned to live with, a burden she would later admit followed her closely and quietly shadowed her heart for the rest of her life. Behind the glitter, applause, and studio lights were broken relationships and a moment that would slowly but permanently reshape everything. By the middle of the 1930s, Dale Evans was finally beginning to carve out her own place in the entertainment industry. Her name was becoming recognizable, her voice familiar, and her future, at least professionally, seemed to be gaining real momentum. After her marriage to August Wayne Jones ended in 1935, she tried once again to rebuild her personal life. Just 2 years later, in 1937, she entered another marriage, this time to pianist and arranger Robert Dale Butts. On the surface, it appeared to be a natural pairing. They shared music, performance, and creative work. They collaborated professionally, spending long hours side by side. Yet, much like the marriages that came before it, the relationship was fragile from the start, unfolding under constant emotional strain. Although they created music together, the bond they shared away from the stage never deepened into real emotional closeness. The partnership existed in sound and schedules, but not in intimacy or understanding. And, once again, history repeated itself. By 1946, that marriage too ended in divorce, closing yet another painful chapter in Dale Evans' long and restless search for stability, security, and belonging. Still, even as her personal life quietly fractured behind closed doors, her professional ascent showed no sign of slowing. At 20th Century Fox, she continued gaining momentum, first securing work as a featured singer, and then gradually stepping into film appearances of her own. With a voice that carried both smooth warmth and unmistakable confidence, she fit effortlessly into the sound and spirit of jazz, swing, and big band music. Soon, her reach expanded far beyond studio walls. She began performing regularly on the hugely popular Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy radio show, a powerful platform that introduced her to audiences across the entire nation. At the same time, Hollywood carefully reshaped her public image from the ground up. She was styled in dazzling cowgirl costumes, embroidered gauntlets, sparkling rhinestone boots, dramatic fringe jackets, each outfit designed to reinforce a new screen identity. Step by step, performance by performance, she was being transformed into something unforgettable. And in front of the cameras and radio microphones, Dale Evans was steadily reinvented as a glamorous Western star, while the real woman behind the image continued carrying a life, a past, and a pain no audience was ever meant to see. In a stunning turn that almost no one in Hollywood could have predicted, her entire career took a dramatic new direction in 1944, the moment she was cast opposite Roy Rogers in The Cowboy and the Senorita. From the very first scenes they shared, something electric filled the air, an unmistakable spark that burned just as brightly off the screen as it did in front of the cameras. But at the time, both of their lives were still firmly connected to other people. Roy was married to his second wife, Arlene, and Dale was still legally bound to her husband, Butts. And yet, quietly, steadily, and almost invisibly, fate was already moving pieces behind the scenes, rewriting a story neither of them could stop. Then, in 1946, everything collapsed into heartbreak when Arlene died shortly after giving birth to their son, Roy Jr., a loss that changed the course of every life involved forever. In what felt like a single devastating moment, the beloved cowboy hero of America became a widower, suddenly carrying the crushing responsibility of raising 3 young children on his own. Dale, who understood sorrow and personal loss far better than most, entered his life not as a headline, not as gossip, and not as a scandal, but something far quieter and far more powerful. Comfort, steady support, and genuine understanding during the darkest stretch of his life. What began as simple companionship slowly, naturally, deepened into something neither of them had planned until the bond between them could no longer be ignored. And by the end of 1947, Roy found a way to ask the most important question in a way only he could, balanced on his horse Trigger just moments before riding into a roaring, packed rodeo arena in Chicago. As the year slipped towards its final days, a brand new chapter finally opened for both of them. On December 31st, 1947, they were married at the Flying L Ranch in Oklahoma, right in the middle of filming Home in Oklahoma. For Dale, it marked her 4th marriage, for Roy, his 3rd. But unlike every road they had walked before, this time the story would not fade quietly into memory. Together, they stepped into American legend, hailed by fans everywhere as Hollywood's King of the Cowboys and the Queen of the West. From the outside, their union seemed to promise nothing but love, fame, and a shining new beginning. But behind closed doors, private struggles were never far away. Love, loss, and the book that would ultimately change everything were already waiting just ahead. After the wedding, Dale didn't simply marry Roy Rogers, she embraced his entire world, including the 3 children he had shared with Arlene, Cheryl, Linda Lou, and Roy Jr., who was lovingly called Dusty. Roy, in return, opened his own heart fully to Dale's son, Tommy. No longer forced to hide behind the painful, carefully constructed story that he was her brother, Dale could finally acknowledge him openly as her child, without fearing Hollywood's harsh judgment. Slowly, their home transformed into something rare and remarkable, a blended family shaped not only by biology, but also by adoption, fostering, and choice, all stitched together through compassion, patience, and love. By 1950, joy and heartbreak arrived side by side. Dale gave birth to the only biological child she and Roy would ever share, a baby girl they named Robin Elizabeth. She was born with Down syndrome and severe medical challenges. In an era when developmental disabilities were barely discussed and often deliberately hidden, Dale and Roy suddenly found themselves surrounded by whispers, subtle criticism, and quiet pressure to keep their daughter out of public view. Instead of withdrawing, they chose a path that demanded courage. They surrounded Robin with tenderness, fierce devotion, and unmistakable pride. But tragedy returned once more when Robin passed away in 1952, just weeks before her second birthday, after complications linked to her condition. The loss broke Dale in ways she barely explained. For a long time, the weight of grief was so heavy that even her faith felt distant, fragile, and painfully hard to reach. Still, through exhaustion and sorrow, she continued searching for meaning beyond the heartbreak. That search eventually gave rise to something extraordinary. In 1953, Dale published Angel Unaware, a deeply emotional book that told Robin's story as a message spoken from heaven. The book stunned Hollywood, but it reached straight into the hearts of parents across America who had endured the same quiet pain. Long before public conversations about disability became common, Dale used her voice to call for compassion, dignity, and understanding. And through her words, her daughter's brief life continued to touch and change countless families who needed hope most. Looking back on that painful chapter of her life, she would later explain that writing the book felt like both a confession and a kind of emotional release, a deeply personal way of unburdening her heart. She shared that she believed Robin's short life had a greater purpose, to soften hardened hearts and awaken compassion in people who might never have understood such suffering before. Almost immediately after the book was published, the response began to pour in. Letters arrived from families across the country, each one opening a private window into their own stories of pain, healing, and hard-won hope. Quietly but powerfully, charities and organizations began to take notice, and little by little, attitudes started to shift, changing how society viewed children with special needs. Far from the bright lights of fame, in a small corner of Oklahoma, something deeply meaningful was taking place. The County Council for Mentally Challenged Children made the decision to rename their center in Dale's honor, creating a permanent and living tribute to Robin's memory. With that single heartfelt gesture, Dale was no longer seen only as a popular entertainer. To grieving parents everywhere, she became a steady and courageous voice, someone who transformed personal heartbreak into a powerful call for understanding, dignity, and kindness. Yet beneath the brave public image she carried so gracefully, quiet sorrow followed her closely, lingering in the background as one more heavy burden that would later shape her most honest and revealing confessions. Then came success, family, and another life-changing blow. At the height of the 1950s, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans rose to an extraordinary level of fame. Side by side, they became one of America's most beloved couples, headlining a long and successful run of Western films, including Don't Fence Me In and Under California Stars. Between 1951 and 1957, their popularity reached living rooms across the nation through The Roy Rogers Show, with Roy riding his legendary horse Trigger and Dale appearing proudly on her buckskin mare Buttermilk. Across the country, week after week, families gathered around their televisions to watch them solve mysteries, celebrate strong values, and close every episode with messages of faith and optimism. Beyond the screen, their music career flourished just as brightly. Songs like Happy Trails became lasting favorites, perfectly reflecting the image they shared with the world, a couple who always found a way forward through hardship. Through Dale's songwriting and gentle, reassuring voice, their music carried a special warmth and sincerity, while Roy's unmistakable cowboy charm helped seal their reputation as the ultimate Western sweethearts. But behind closed doors, their lives were expanding in a very different and deeply personal way. Along with Roy's children from his first marriage and Dale's son, Tommy, the couple opened their hearts and their home to 4 adopted children. Mimi, a foster daughter from Scotland, Dodie, a Native American girl, Sandy, and Debbie. Their household overflowed with movement, energy, and laughter, shaped by children from many different backgrounds, all bound together by love, discipline, and a shared faith. But in 1964, tragedy returned without warning. Debbie, their adopted daughter, lost her life at only 12 years old in a devastating church bus accident. Suddenly and without mercy, the loss tore through the family. Years later, Dale would confess that this moment stood among the darkest she had ever faced. She spoke openly about the crushing guilt that followed her, quietly questioning whether something, anything she might have done could have changed the outcome. For Roy and Dale, saying goodbye to another child reopened the deep, unhealed wounds left behind by Robin's death. Once again, grief settled heavily over their family and over their lives. Haunted by the long shadow of the accident, Roy and Dale made the heartbreaking decision to walk away from their sprawling Chatsworth ranch, a place filled with laughter, history, and far too many painful memories, and try to start over in Apple Valley, California, at the R Bar Ranch, clinging to the hope that distance itself might finally bring them a measure of peace. What appeared on the surface to be a fresh beginning in a new home and a new landscape, however, could never truly erase the deep grief Dale carried over Debbie's death, and no matter how far she traveled, that sorrow continued to follow her quietly and relentlessly. From that painful turning point forward, something in Dale changed, and a deeper, more raw and unfiltered honesty about suffering and faith began to shape every speech she gave, every interview she granted, and every book she shared with the world. No longer willing to remain trapped inside the cheerful and carefully polished image of Hollywood's smiling cowgirl, Dale slowly began speaking openly about grief itself, offering comfort and understanding to others, even as she privately wrestled with her own doubts, her faith, her growing activism, and the painful reality of a marriage under strain. By the time the 1960s arrived, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans had become far more than familiar faces on movie screens and television sets. They had stepped into a much larger role as public voices for their personal beliefs. And more than almost anyone expected, it was Dale who moved boldly to the front, emerging as a fearless and outspoken advocate for Christianity in everyday public life. Standing before a massive crowd in Los Angeles in 1964, she called for the return of mandatory prayer in schools and declared that America's children, in her words, needed guidance from the Lord. Unwilling to remain quiet or neutral, she openly aligned herself with conservative causes and even took part in campaigning for presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. Across every corner of her career, from the songs she chose to record to the speeches she delivered across the country, her personal convictions were tightly woven into her work, slowly transforming her into a moral guide for countless admirers who respected her courage and her willingness to stand alone. Behind the cameras, the bright lights, and the thunder of applause, however, the reality of her private life with Roy looked far less flawless than the beloved partnership audiences adored on screen. As the years moved forward, Dale gradually began to speak about the intense and often invisible pressures that existed inside their marriage. To the public, Roy remained the gentle and legendary king of the cowboys, but inside their home, he was known for being a strict disciplinarian, particularly with his children. During the long stretches when Roy was away filming or traveling on tour, Dale frequently found herself left alone. She would later admit that loneliness and emotional strain filled those quiet years, and that no amount of cheering crowds or public praise could ever take that private pain away. What haunted her most, however, was not only the silence in her home, but the lie she had been forced to live during the earliest years of her career. For more than 10 years, she had told the public that her son, Tommy, was actually her younger brother, a carefully crafted story created by the studio to protect her wholesome and marketable image. Even long after she finally told the truth following her marriage to Roy, Dale confessed that hiding her motherhood for so many years never truly stopped troubling her heart. Carrying that secret became a heavy and silent burden, slowly chipping away at her sense of identity and at her understanding of who she really was beneath the spotlight. And yet, in the middle of that long and private struggle, Dale chose to turn her suffering into something meaningful and lasting. Through more than a dozen books, she offered messages of hope to grieving parents and encouraged readers everywhere to lean on faith when hardship felt overwhelming and life seemed unbearably fragile. When interviewers later asked how she wanted to be remembered, Dale explained that it would never be for her sparkling cowgirl outfits or her carefully styled Hollywood image, but for her honesty about pain, loss, and brokenness. By revealing the wounded and imperfect places in her own life, she believed she could help others find the courage to begin healing their own. And even as she became more open about her personal struggles, she continued to honor Roy in public, never allowing her growing candor to weaken, replace, or diminish the respect she still held for him. She never shied away from the struggles that defined her life, yet she always highlighted the love and respect that held them together for more than 50 years. Their story was a tangled reality, a marriage stitched together by devotion, shadowed by heartache, and humanized by the imperfections only real people possess. The final years of their life together brought a sorrowful farewell, one that no one could ignore. As the 1970s and 1980s unfolded, television was changing in ways no one could have predicted. Yet even as the small screen evolved, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans remained icons, adored by generations, cherished as the king and queen of the West. Time often found them side by side on nostalgic programs, introducing classic films, recounting Hollywood's golden memories, and reminding viewers why their legend had endured for decades. By the 1990s, Dale had even stepped into her own spotlight, leading a religious program that seamlessly blended her deep faith with her public persona. Still, behind the cameras and applause, their personal journey was increasingly defined by fragility, loss, and the relentless passing of time. Roy's health began to decline throughout the 1990s, testing the strength of a bond that had lasted more than half a century. Dale, the ever-loyal partner, remained steadfast at his side until his passing on July 6, 1998. His death didn't just mark the end of a marriage, it marked the end of an era, a partnership that had shaped her life in ways both profound and irreplaceable. For Dale, the grief was both heartbreakingly private and painfully public. The legendary duo that had defined so much of her world was no more. Left to navigate life alone, Dale faced her remaining years without the man who had been her anchor. Her body weakened, but the weight of grief, memory, and reflection pressed even heavier. With Roy gone, she finally began to reveal truths she had long kept beneath the surface. The loneliness she endured during his long absences, the tension of his strict parenting, and the lingering regret of presenting her son, Tommy, as her brother. These admissions stunned fans who had long imagined their marriage as flawless, yet Dale insisted on facing reality head-on. Mom wasn't afraid to speak the truth, her daughter Dottie later reflected. Embracing both the good and the bad is what makes a person whole. Dale Evans passed away on February 7, 1998, at the age of 88, just 3 years after Roy. Her children remembered her final days as peaceful, with Dale expressing a quiet readiness to reunite with her husband and the children she had mourned. Her passing closed the final chapter of one of Hollywood's most enduring partnerships, leaving behind a story far richer and far more complicated than the silver screen image had ever suggested. It was a tale of glamour and faith, yes, but also sorrow, secrets, and unyielding resilience. Dale Evans and Roy Rogers will forever be celebrated as icons, yet beneath the legend, wounds lingered that never fully healed. Dale's last confessions reminded the world that even the brightest stars carry burdens too heavy to hide.